Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Down Periscope Up Periscope. We're here in Blueback's control room, and today we're going to talk about the diving, or the pilot station, as it's sometimes called, and answer the question that we often get: why does Blueback have two steering wheels? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. That one's for turning left, that one's for turning right. Make sense? And sometimes, we have an instructor and a student driver in here, so, normally you're not going to go 65 down a one-way street. Extend your arm, extend your middle finger. Nah, I'm kidding, of course. Yeah, that's a Naked Gun reference. Anyway, so the diving station here is really just where the submarine is steered from. Bear in mind that this is 1950s technology. The system itself is electrohydraulically operated. So when the wheels are turned or the columns are pushed and pulled, they actuate order servos which transmit electrical signals to the power servos, which then in turn port hydraulic fluid into the steering and diving rams for the plane and rudder system on the submarine. Now, the earlier experimental Albacore research submarine was actually the first submarine out there to introduce sort of aircraft style controls for the diving station. So essentially, the Barbell class were the first production attack submarines to have these types of controls, which were revolutionary at the time for submarines. Furthermore, behind us is the ballast control panel, and the Barbell class were the first attack submarines out there actually to introduce kind of push button or these toggle style controls for the controlling the ballast tanks. But anyway, that's for another time. So let's take a look at what these positions do. Normally, the inboard chair here is for the helmsman. He controls the fair water or sail planes and the rudder. So whether we go left or right or up or down. The outboard chair here is for the planesman. He's controlling the stern planes back where the rudder is. That is the angle of the submarine. So these two have to work together to make sure we don't crash or hit anything, or do any crazy maneuvers for that matter. Now, obviously, there's no windows. How do you know where we're going? Well, you're going to have to follow the orders of the officer of the deck. And behind you is the station for the quartermaster. He's going to navigate for you, and he's essentially going to tell you where to go. So all you have to do is follow orders and steer the proper course. Furthermore, this submarine has a test depth of about 712 feet, and not much sunlight, or actually no sunlight really, gets below about 600 or 650 feet. So even if there were windows on the submarine, you would not see anything anyway. So it doesn't matter. And this is not a research submarine, so we don't even need windows because there's no need to even look outside. You just follow orders and steer the appropriate course. So let's talk a little bit about what these switches in the center are. These control which station controls what. So over here, we have the steering selector switch. So you can switch the steering selection to either the inboard or the outboard position, in which case one of these, the inboard or the outboard, would, of course, control the rudder. Now, I recall one tour guide, he mentioned that there is a little girl on his tour, like sitting in one of these chairs, and she's like, well, what if one guy steers, right, and the other guy steers left? The idea being that they're fighting over control of the rudder. And he's like, well, that can't happen because only one of these stations at any given time can control the rudder. And apparently she didn't accept that answer, and she's like, but what if it does? Well, then the chief of the watch sitting behind you is going to smack you on the back of the head and tell you to mind your helm because you're being an idiot. So you can control steering either via the inboard or outboard position. Both of them cannot control the rudder at the same time. Now, when this is switched to emergency power, provided there's still vital hydraulic power, then the steering is controlled here with the auxiliary helm, with this orange handle right here, effectively turning this whole thing into a three-man control system. Now here we have the diving mode selector switch. This switch determines whether the planes are operated under a two-man or one-man control system. Under two-man control there, then the planes are operated as I described, with this inboard chair controlling the sail planes and the outboard chair controlling the stern planes. Now when it's set to one-man control, you switch this to either the inboard or the outboard position. So let's say we switch it to inboard here. Then you go down here to the plane selector switch, and using this switch, you can control whether that particular selected station controls either the stern planes or the fairwater and the stern planes. So when it's set for fairwater and stern, then the inboard position in this case will control both sets of planes. If you select stern only, then this position would control only the stern planes. Now, another thing to note is that there's actually two positions here for stern only, but from my reading of the electrical diagrams on the submarine, it doesn't matter which one it's switched to, they both do the same thing. So, yep, stern only or stern only, it doesn't matter what it's switched to. Now, when it is in a two-man control position, then the plane selector switch is actually completely bypassed, and it goes back to simply just sailplanes and stern planes. Now, if this were to be set to emergency mode, then provided that there's still vital hydraulic power available, then the planes are operating the same way as two-man control. So again, sailplanes and stern planes. Now, in the event that electrical or main hydraulic system power is lost, then the steering columns are operated in dive mode as it would be in normal mode, with the column linkages transmitting vital hydraulic system power directly into the steering rams and the diving rams. Vital power is passed to the emergency control valves via blocking valves, which are normally shut when they're energized, but with the loss of electrical power or when the switches are set to emergency, then they open up and allow vital hydraulic power to pass through. And similarly, the main hydraulic system blocking valves will automatically shut if there's a loss of power. So the steering in emergency mode, however, will still have to be accomplished with the auxiliary helm over there. Other than that, these things will still operate the diving planes in the event of electrical or main hydraulic system failure. Now, in the event that you lose both electrical and hydraulic power, then you're going to have to use hand pumps in the auxiliary machinery space to manually move the rudder and the stern planes. There's also a hand pump in the torpedo room, which will manually control the fairwater planes. Now, the manual actuation of these planes are controlled with valves in these spaces, which change the direction in which the planes or the rudder would move. Now, it's also worth noting that the two planes for both the fairwater and the stern, as well as the rudders, are connected. In other words, both planes move together in sync, so they cannot move like independently. We can't have like the starboard sailplane and the port side sailplane move independently of each other. They're linked together, so when one moves up and down, so does the other one. Same thing with the stern planes, and same thing with the rudders. So you can't like do like a crazy like aileron roll like in an aircraft or anything like that. This submarine can't do that. So both the planes move at the same time together. Now, there's another system on these steering columns themselves that forms a really kind of rudimentary autopilot system, if you will. So there's a pin in these steering columns that you can push to lock the forward and backward movement, and you use this chrome wheel here to tighten it up and prevent these from steering left or right. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, for example, let's say you're going to be going on such and such a course at such and such a speed for a given amount of time, and you're not going to be doing any course changes or anything like that. So you just tighten this wheel up so it doesn't steer left or right. And let's say you're going to be staying at a certain depth for a long period of time. So you just push the pin, lock this wheel, this column here, and you just sit here. Yep. Just make sure you don't do anything crazy. And of course, you would follow these gauges and make sure you're not drifting off course or anything. So again, it forms a sort of rudimentary system for locking these wheels in place, keeping them from moving forward or backward or left and right, forming a kind of simple autopilot system. But that's how it works. People can also occasionally ask what these are down here. These are not like gas pedals or foot pedals or anything. They're just footrests is all they are. So because you do not control the propulsion from this space. So the propulsion is sent down via a bell, via the motor order telegraph right here. So you'd change this, right? And that would ring a bell down in the maneuvering room, which is in the stern of the submarine. And they would match up the needles known as answering bells, and they'd change the propulsion, that is the forward and backward or the speed of the submarine back there. So you only signal up here on this back in maneuvering, and they're going to change the speed of the submarine. Now I'm going to end off here by saying, unfortunately, we have had to lock these wheels, both of them, from moving either left and right or forward and backward, because the kids on the tours were basically playing with these things so much that they eventually broke. Like these wheels used to be spring loaded, so when you turn them left or right and you release them and let them go, the wheel would just automatically return to center. But they turn them so much that the springs inside are broken. And furthermore, tour guides down in the torpedo room, they noticed that every so often when they were giving tours down in torpedo room, there's another tour up here in control, and the guys in the torpedo room would hear this banging noise because kids were pushing these columns all the way to the stops, and you hear this bang, 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 bang. Yeah. So fortunately, I've ordered the the tour guides to just lock these things, don't move them, don't let people move them at all. So just to preserve them simply as artifacts so we don't damage them any further. Which is also kind of unfortunate because, you know, people, especially a lot of kids, they kind of treat this submarine like it's an amusement park ride or whatever, and they're in like a fighter jet or something or whatever. You're going to pull in all these extreme maneuvers or whatever. No, it's not a playground. And furthermore, we used to be able to actually do a diving simulation because the gauges here on this console in front of you used to move when you move these steering columns. And the depth gauge here would move as well. So you could do like a whole really cool diving simulation where you'd have two people sat here at the dive station and the tour guide would be standing where I'm standing right now. And you'd say like, okay, we're going to dive this submarine. Ready? Dive, dive. You say, okay, everyone, push forward on those steering wheels, right? And you see the depth gauge move. All right, let's take her down to 200 feet. Make your depth 200 feet. Aye, sir. So you push forward. You see this go to 200 feet. All right, level off. Okay, we're down here. We're slowed down. It's really quiet. All right, let's take her up to periscope depth. Pull back on the wheels. Make your depth 60 feet. So they pull back up here till the depth gauge read 60 feet. All right, now still course, 270, whatever, and they'd steer that course. So you did this really cool diving simulation. But unfortunately, again, because people have played with these things so much, they're broken. And currently, we don't have the time, the money, the equipment, or the manpower to fix these things. And we have not found any kind of manual that shows the exact components and how to service these things. So if we had the time and the manual and the money and all that to actually fix these things, then yeah, we probably would do it. But unfortunately, we don't. So currently, they're just locked. I mean, truth be told, we could probably just pull this thing off and tear it apart and figure out what was wrong with it and probably fix it. It's probably not that difficult. But unfortunately, again, we just don't have the time. We don't have the money. We don't have the people to do it. So for now, these are remaining locked and we're not doing any kind of cool diving simulation like we used to do. So that's that. But anyway, that is a rather long-winded answer about why Blueback has two steering wheels. Helmsman here controlling the rudder and the sail planes. The planesman there controlling the stern planes. So, and those switches there in the middle can be used to change who controls what and under what situations, whether or not you need to switch in the case of a loss of hydraulic or electrical power. Of course, there's more to it than that. I'm just kind of brushing the surface, but that is the long-winded answer of why Blueback has two steering wheels. Now, I'm going to end off this episode with a little bit more about some of my thoughts on the tours themselves, and I'll talk a little bit more about some other things that kind of cross my mind when I talk about interactive portions of the tour. So we've had to curtail or completely remove many of the more interactive parts of the Blueback tour over the years due to just wear and tear on the submarine as an exhibit itself, and our inability to acquire spare parts when things break. Now, as I mentioned before, but honestly it's worth reiterating, while museums ideologically stand for the preservation of artifacts and the education of people, the reality of museum operations is that any artifact that can be handled by people, such as these control yokes and the diving station stuff, will eventually be destroyed. And we also had instances of people actually stealing artifacts from the submarine. I specifically recall one where I was on a phone call from a father whose 5-year-old kid stole something from the submarine. Now, when the father found out about this, he was good enough to contact us, and he had his son explain himself over the phone to me. So as I'm on this phone with this kid, I asked the kid, like, okay, why did you take this artifact? And his reply was, because I wanted it. So, yeah, I mean, again, 5 years old, he doesn't understand much. So I ended up giving this young boy a short lecture on, having integrity, doing the right thing, not stealing things and all that. And eventually, the father mailed the artifact back. Now, more to the point, though, honestly, I was just kind of floored that a parent in this day and age would actually hold their child accountable for their actions. Yeah, you just rarely see that nowadays, right? It's like, what? You mean you're actually contacting us to right something wrong that your child did? Oh my goodness! Oh, my heart has just skipped a beat there. Oh my gosh, So yeah, there's some parenting going the correct way, the right way, you might say. So good on them. It was kind of an insignificant thing, but yeah, that was just kind of a nice little bright spot in this otherwise dismal, gloomy world we live in today. Now, it does bring me to another point, which I have said before on this podcast, but it deserves to be repeated ad nauseum. The submarine is not a playground or an amusement park ride. So, kids, if you want a playground where you can climb over stuff and play with things, then, well, OMSI does have a science playground. It's on the second floor, and it's for ages 0 to 6. And if you're expecting a roller coaster, then Oaks Amusement Park is literally just a 5-mile drive south of us. That's where the fun rides are. The submarine doesn't go anywhere, and it can't go underwater anymore because it's a museum exhibit. However, it is designed as a warship. It's an industrial environment and not something for your personal amusement. Believe me, it's very easy to injure yourself on this thing because everything is hard and made of steel. On active submarines, head injuries are somewhat common for what I've been told. Even on Blueback, injuries happen to tour guides, even though we work here every day. I've fallen down ladders, I've cut and bruised myself, I've hit my head on pipes and valves and door frames and hatches. And even when I'm being really careful about how I move through this boat and what I touch, and I know exactly where to step, before you know it, you get complacent and you don't watch where you're stepping, and then bam! And I'm not even a tall or a big guy, and it still happens to me on occasion. Now, consider the fact that the tallest sailor to actually serve on Blueback, I've been told, was 6 foot 8 inches. Yeah. And I recently had a submarine sailor aboard a ballistic missile submarine on my tour who was 6'8". I asked him, how tall are you? And he's like 6'8". And he was ducking throughout the entire tour. I even had a guy on my tour, not a veteran himself, but I asked him how tall he was, and he was 6'11". So he was really ducking even more throughout the tour. So yes, kids, the submarine's not a playground. It's not an amusement park ride. Please don't treat it as such. If you want a submarine amusement park ride, well, they have 8 of them down in Anaheim, California, right there between Fantasyland and Tomorrowland. They're looking for Nemo. It used to be the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea ride, or before that, I think the Nautilus submarine ride or something like that. Although, to be honest, they're not actual submarines. They're just boats, but they have windows at the bottom so you can see out underwater in them. But anyway, that's beside the point. Or you can just actually join the Navy and join submarines. But you'll quickly realize that it's not an amusement park ride, so... Now, I'll end this off by saying I have written more about this. I've looked at a little bit of other submarine control rooms and looked at early attempts at digitization of the controls of submarines, attempts at automating submarine controls, and even modern submarines compared with Los Angeles or Seawolf or modern Virginia-class submarines. So if you're interested in reading more about this stuff, comparing it to Blueback's old electro-hydraulic systems, there's a link down in the description to my blog post I wrote on this, so you can check that out. As always, OMSI is a nonprofit organization. It receives donations from various other organizations and donations from listeners and visitors like you. If you'd like more information about Blueback, you can visit the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry's website at omsi.edu. Anyway, that'll do it for this one. So thank you everyone for listening or watching, and I hope you have a good day.